This video is sponsored by Auskang Smart Card Wallets. Oh hey, welcome to Flynndogg Woodwork. So today I've got a video for beginners. I've got 29 tips that I wish I would have known when I first started woodworking. So let's dig into it and see what tips I've got. So today's video is for that woodworker that's just starting out. One thing you'll learn about woodworking is you accumulate knowledge as you get more experience doing the craft. And if you're a seasoned woodworker, you're probably going to be like, duh, that's common knowledge. But these are all things that I've learned over the years from frankly making a lot of mistakes. And if you're just starting out, you're probably going to make these mistakes too, as that's just part of the deal with woodworking. We all learn as we go. And I've got these 29 different points categorized in 7 different categories, and I thought what better place to start than over at the table saw. So the cornerstone to any shop is the table saw, and we're going to be hitting this tool a few times in today's video. And because we have 29 tips and observations today, we're going to be moving just a little bit faster. So let's get started with our first table saw tip. One thing that I didn't realize was so important on my table saw was this little shark fin on the very back of my blade. And for seasoned woodworkers, we all know what this does, but for beginners, I think it's worth talking about. This little piece of metal comes standard on all table saws, including job site table saws, and this essentially acts as a wedge. No matter how stable your wood is, wood can tend to have tension built up on the interior of the board. And even though we're removing wood, the wood can sometimes have internal tension pinching the two pieces of wood together. And it's that riving knife that's going to act like a wedge, keeping the two pieces of wood separated. And if you were to remove this riving knife, there's a high likelihood that this tension would pinch onto one of the teeth on your saw blade and cause kickback. And I've seen a lot of people on YouTube operating without a riving knife, and this is the equivalent of riding a motorcycle without a helmet.
Helmets?
I can only think of 2 situations where I take out my riving knife. One is when I use a dado stack, and the other time is when I'm doing a cove cut. So first tip, keep that bad boy in there. That riving knife is there for a reason. Now I want to talk about cross cuts over at the table saw using both your miter gauge and the table saw fence. And this tip kind of goes hand in hand with that riving knife tip. When doing a cross cut, you're essentially removing any effectiveness that the riving knife may have had. And that's because since the riving knife sits behind the blade, it will have no impact on the wood until it's already cut through. And because of this, we need to be careful when using our fence during cross cuts. If we use our table saw fence in combination with our miter gauge, the piece that's in between the blade and the fence has no room to fall away. And since we have no help from our riving knife and this piece is cut free, this can instantly cause kickback. Let me show you a better way to make this cut. The way that I like to make cross cuts is to set my measurement with my table saw fence. Then I'll push the table saw fence to the side and take something like a wax marker. Then I can mark off where I need to make my cut. I can also use something like a rare earth magnet to set my measurement so that I can do repeatable cuts. By using something like a rare earth magnet, you can see how your cutoff piece will fall to the side and not be pinched up in between your table saw fence and your blade, creating kickback. My next table saw tip relates to the miter gauge. Now every table saw will come with a miter gauge. The problem is the out-of-the-box miter gauge is frankly kind of junk. Even high-end table saws like SawStops come with rudimentary miter gauges. Now the reason I don't like these out-of-the-box miter gauges is they provide very little support. In the case of this SawStop, it's just a little over 6 inches. Now you can buy aftermarket miter gauges like this Craig and they work great. The problem is they're not that cheap. In fact, this one cost almost $200. But there's an easy and cheap way to convert your out-of-the-box miter gauge into something that works like that Craig. On the back of most miter gauges, you're going to find small little holes. These are perfect for attaching something like plywood or MDF to extend the support of your workpiece. By simply driving in a couple of screws into that plywood, you can instantly extend your fence as long as you want. Once you have those screws driven in, you instantly have something that resembles those aftermarket miter gauges. Now let's talk about cutting thin strips of wood over at that table saw. Now we've all done it before. We've tried to cut some thin strips using our table saw fence. This is a great way to lose some fingers or even tear up an old push stick. But there's a better way to cut these strips, and this is something that I definitely didn't know about when I first started out. There's actually a thing called a thin rip jig. And this is a jig that I always turn to in any strips that I cut under 1/2 inch. By using a thin rip jig, you set the width of your cut on the left-hand side of the blade versus the right. This eliminates the pinch you get between the blade and the fence and creates a much safer cut, as your strip will safely fall to the side and all you need to do is adjust your fence so that you can make your next cut. And if you're just starting out, you're probably making a lot of cutting boards, and a thin rip jig is a no-brainer in my book. Before we move on, let's take a moment to talk about today's sponsor, Auskang Smart Card Wallets. Auskang wallets are one of the first wallets that I've found that seamlessly integrate with the iPhone or iPad Find My app. Not only that, but these wallets are Apple M5 certified, which means that you'll get all the Apple security. But let's take a look at what the wallet looks like. If we take a look at the wallet, you can see it's got an external card holder as well as a money clip. And even though this is an ergonomic and attractive wallet, there's some technical features with this wallet that I want to share. First of all, have you ever lost your wallet? This is something that I do on almost a daily basis. Well, since this wallet is connected to the Apple Find My app, this will no longer be an issue. By logging into the Find My app, you can easily see the current location of where your wallet's at. And just like with Apple devices, you'll be able to share the location of your wallet with friends or family to help you find it, have messages sent to your phone every time you leave your wallet behind, or simply play a sound to help you locate it in the room you're in. Not only that, but this wallet has RFID blocking as well as a 5-year battery life, so no need for charging. Not to mention, if it's found by a stranger, they can contact you through the preset contact information. So if you're looking to join the 21st century, check out these smart wallets made by Auskang. They really are amazing, and I guarantee you're never going to lose your wallet again. So check out the links below to see how you can purchase this amazing smart card wallet made by Auskang. Thanks again to Auskang for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to those tips. Now let's move on to measuring. Now for this area, I only have 3 points for this video. The first item I want to talk about is using referential measurements. Now when I first started out, I would use plans all the time, and I thought I had to have all my measurements exactly as they were on my plans. But the truth of the matter is, once your first cuts are made and they've left either the table saw or the miter saw, you're working off entirely different measurements. And that's because we're going to make errors. Our wood's going to move on us, and things aren't going to fit together the way that we planned. So even though we wanted the width of our table to be 24 inches wide, we're actually at 23 7/8. And that's the measurement we should be going off of moving forward. So be flexible, use referential measurements, and please, dear Lord, don't cut all your pieces to size before you've done any assembly. The next thing that I want to talk about is measurement and calibration of some of your major power tools. Let's take the table saw for instance. There's a lot of measurements on our table saw that I used to wholeheartedly trust. For instance, if my table saw told me I was at 2 inches, I relied upon that measurement. And they wouldn't put degree measurements for your table saw if they weren't accurate, right? Well, the truth is, tool measurements are only as accurate as what they're calibrated to. And it's a good idea to use something like a 1-2-3 block or even a tape measure to check those measurements. If they're off, sometimes tools will have adjustable dials so that you can get the precise measurements. But sometimes you can't adjust those gauges, and that's why it's a good idea to have something like an angle finder or your ordinary square. Squares are quick and easy to make sure things like your table saw blade are perfectly square, while things like angle finders can help you dial in those 45-degree cuts. So take a little time to calibrate your tools to make sure they're giving you the measurements you need. And that leads me to my next tip, which is to check those tools for calibration between each batch that you cut. This is something that even I forget to do some of the times. A lot of times when you're making a lot of repetitive cuts, you can tend to knock things out of their calibration. In fact, this happens to me quite a lot at tools like my jointer. My fence gets knocked out of square all the time. So every couple of boards, I just like to take my square to make sure that I'm maintaining that perfect 90 degrees. So unfortunately, tools are not a set it and forget it type of situation. It's a good idea to check those measurements in between each of your batches. Now let's move on to my next set of observations, which all relate to wood. My first tip is to know when wood is firewood. Now I'm typically a wood hoarder.
Wait, what did you say?
And it's very hard for me to throw any wood away, let alone hardwood. And I just recently cleaned out all my scrap wood, but I still found this 5-inch piece of poplar. Will I ever use this piece? Probably not, and it's just taking up space in my shop. In fact, next time I need a piece of poplar, I'll probably go to the hardware store. So it's a good idea, even though you may not follow it, to set a minimum dimension of the wood that you'll keep. Now the next tip that I have is one that probably most of you already know, but if there's one person out there that doesn't know this, I thought it was worth discussing. The thickness of plywood is rarely at its advertised width. Just take a look at these two pieces of plywood. The first piece of plywood is 3/4 inch plywood. The second piece of plywood is 1/2" plywood. And that little bit of difference can cause big issues if you're using plywood in your projects. These little differences can create gaps in your dados and rabbets and give you the results you're not expecting. Another misconception that I had about plywood when I first started out is that all the factory edges were square. But unfortunately, this just isn't the case. And in fact, this new sheet of plywood even has some variance along this 12-inch span up to 1/8 of an inch. So if you're looking for precision, don't rely on the factory edges of plywood. It's because of this variance that one of the greatest tools that I purchased in early woodworking was a track saw. Now this will probably be an unpopular suggestion, but I think it's worth looking at a track saw if you're just starting out. These are coming down in price and you can even get a Wen for less than $200. And the track saw is going to make it that much easier to break down your plywood right at the line that you want to cut. Now if you don't want to buy a track saw, there's other ways that you can break down that unsquare sheet of plywood, like using a 2x4 or even a level. A couple of clamps, a 2x4, and a level can get you those square corners that you're looking for in your plywood. But I still stand behind my position of looking at a track saw as a beginner, as there's nothing more dangerous than trying to break down plywood over at the table saw. The next thing that I want to talk about is wood selection, specifically woods that burn. Now one of the first projects that I made to give out as gifts were little Christmas trees that were made out of maple. And I used a very sharp bandsaw and jigsaw blade to cut out those shapes. And this project was an absolute nightmare. I spent well over half of my time sanding out those burn marks that I had in those Christmas trees. Now if I was smarter back then, I probably would have used a wood that has less of a tendency to burn. Now all wood can burn, but some woods tend to burn easier than others. And here's 3 species of wood with different types of burning. On the top you'll find the walnut with very little burn. In the middle you'll find cherry with just a little bit more burn. And on the very bottom you'll find that easily burnable maple, which shows up more than any other wood. So just be aware if you're dealing with intricate work, especially if you have to do a lot of sanding, wood selection may save you a lot of time. Before we move on to our next area, I ask you to do me a huge favor, hit that subscribe button, leave a like and leave a comment. It really does help out this small woodworking channel. Also, check out my new website, www.flynndoggwoodwork.com. There you can find all sorts of shop updates as well as tool recommendations and ways that you can support the channel. I also sell all the t-shirts that I wear in my videos, so if any of those interest you, check out www.flynndoggwoodwork.com. Now let's get back to the video. So the next area I'd like to talk about today relates to the topic of saw blades. First and foremost, I want to talk about saw blade kerf. When I first started woodworking, I made a lot of errors not accounting for the kerf of the blade. And the kerf of the blade is simply just the thickness of the blade itself. And there's 2 main areas where I made mistakes relating to the kerf. One of the most common areas I made mistakes was over at the miter saw. And that error had everything to do with placing my blade on the correct side of the line that I wanted to cut. If I wanted to keep this area with a check, I would want to place my blade on the left-hand side of that line versus the right-hand side. When I first started out, I just ripped down the center of that line, therefore decreasing the piece that I wanted to keep by a fraction of the blade kerf. The next area I consistently made errors in when not accounting for the kerf was when I was milling up lumber. I would have a piece of wood that's 6 inches wide exactly that I'd want to cut down to 3 2-inch strips. I'd go to slice up all my strips and I always wondered why my last strip was just a little bit thinner. So always spend just a little extra time first measuring your kerf and then accounting for it in your cuts. The next thing that I think is important to know when you're just starting out is the different types of saw blades and what they're used for. And in my opinion, when you're just starting out, there's really only 3 blades that you need to know about: the crosscut, the rip, as well as the combination blade. The first blade that I want to talk about is the crosscut blade, and this is what you're typically going to find over at your miter saw. These blades typically have many more teeth on each blade, and they have much smaller gullets or little holes in between each blade. It's these gullets that remove the sawdust from your cut material. These blades also commonly have angled teeth to chip away at the wood as you're cutting through it. The next blade that I want to talk about is the ripping blade, and this is what I have installed at my table saw. As you can see, it's got fewer teeth and larger gullets in between each tooth. Another common distinction of a rip blade is that it oftentimes has flat teeth. This gives you a very smooth finish when you're cutting your material. The last saw blade we'll talk about is kind of a mixture between a ripping blade and a cross-cutting blade. Therefore, it's called a combination blade. And here's an example of a combination blade. As you can see, it's got more teeth than a ripping blade, but less teeth than a cross-cutting blade. You'll also notice that there's little areas where the gullets are just a little bit larger. And frankly, for the table saw, I think this is one of the best blades you can have installed on that machine. as it allows you to both cross-cut and rip at the same time. The next thing that I want to talk about with saw blades is tear out. Tear out occurs wherever the blade is exiting the wood. And this can be for any saw, whether it's your table saw, your miter saw, or even your jigsaw. Tear out occurs wherever the teeth of your blade exit your workpiece. Since a miter saw spins in this direction, typically your tear out is in the very back. Tear out at the table saw works in the same way. Since your blade spins in this direction, you can expect your tear out to be on the very bottom end. Jigsaws also have tear out. As you can see from this blade here, all the teeth are facing up, so all the tear out will be on the very top of your workpiece. So just be aware of where your tear out might be so that you can put your show face on the opposite side of where that tear out will be. Next, I want to talk about when it's appropriate to either change your table saw blade or your miter saw blade. Remember that burning that we took a look at earlier? Well, this can be one of the first signs that your blade is starting to get dull. Another sign can be that it seems like it's taking forever to get through a piece of wood that you don't remember being that hard to cut through. And I experienced both of these signs a couple of weeks ago when I was building this cherry cabinet. And in fact, I was even getting a little bit of kickback as I was sliding my blade through the cherry. I've since switched the blade out and the difference is remarkable. Now all my cuts are essentially effortless. So if you're experiencing any of those symptoms with your blade, switch them out. You'll be amazed at the difference. The next topic I want to talk about is sanding, and these are 3 things that I wish I would have known when I first started out. Let's first talk about sanding grits. Believe it or not, there is a hard and fast rule for determining which sanding grits you should use on your projects. So what is this rule? Well, it's really quite simple. You never want to go more than 50% above the last grit that you used. I typically don't start with anything under 80 grit sandpaper. Once I'm done with the 80 grit, I go up 50% to 120 grit. After I'm done with the 120, I go up another 50% to 180. And then I finish it off with my final grit at 220. If you follow this model, you're more likely to minimize the amount of sanding marks you get or things like pigtails, which can really ruin your projects. The next thing I'd like to discuss is you should always let your sander do the work for you. Now it can be very easy to tilt your sander at an angle to get rid of a stubborn area, or to apply all your weight to make sanding go just a little bit quicker. But all this is going to do is to create divots and pigtails in your workpiece. So instead, grab a podcast, put some earphones on, and take your time. Should you sand plywood?
Maybe, maybe not.
Well, that's a great question. The short answer is yes. However, you need to understand that the veneer on the very top of plywood is extremely thin, and it's very easy to break through that veneer and expose the plywood. And there's obviously a lot of different situations on how you should handle sanding plywood, but in my experience, I typically don't go under 120 grit. And I do a very light sanding, essentially putting no pressure on that sander. In fact, it's even better if you hand sand it instead. But try not to go below 120 grit, as you're just going to eat through that veneer in a heartbeat. Well, that's going to take us through to our next area of interest, which is all about clamping. So one thing I definitely didn't understand when I first started out is how the forces of clamps interact with your wood. Since I only had a few clamps, it was very common for me to use as few clamps as possible. And because of this, I was getting a lot of separations on many panels that I was gluing up. And there's a reason for that. Let's take a look at an example I made to show you how the force of the clamps interact with that wood. Here I have a mock panel glue up that shows the interaction with the clamps and the wood. As you can see from the darkened areas, this is where the clamping force is interacting with the seams of your glue up. As you can see from the center, there's 2 unsupported areas where there's no clamping force. And there's a good chance you won't even see squeeze out where those unsupported areas are. And what you might see down the road is separation in the center of that panel where the clamping force wasn't applied. But there's obviously an easy fix for this. Just add more clamps so that your glue ups are completely supported. Now in my mind, whenever I do a glue up, I try to envision these triangles to see what's supported. So when you're doing your panel glue ups, envision a diagram like this so that you can get your unsupported areas completely supported. Now you may have noticed that I alternated those clamps on the top and the bottom of the glue up, and there's a reason for that, and that brings us to our next tip. Now when I first started, I used to have all my clamps on the bottom of my glue up. It's quick and easy, you can set down all your clamps and just place your wood right on top. But what you'll come to find out as you add pressure to those clamps, if they're all on one side, it tends to bow up or down depending on where your clamps are. Now that was obviously an exaggerated example using wood flooring, but the same thing will happen even if your sides are flat. To combat this bowing or curving of your panel glue ups, it's a good idea to alternate your clamps on the bottom and the top going down the entire glue up. By alternating your clamps and evenly applying pressure between all your clamps, you can minimize the amount of that bowing on your glue-ups. But sometimes, no matter how hard you try, you just can't get all that bowing out. And that's why I want to talk about my next tip, using Cauls. And for beginners, there's two Cauls that I'd like to introduce you to. The regular straight Caul, which is my most used Caul, and the cambered Caul. Straight Cauls are about as simple as it gets. They're just a piece of straight scrap wood that's wrapped in packing tape. And the only reason they're wrapped in packing tape is so that your Cauls don't get glued to your project. To use these, you simply place one Caul under your glue up and one Caul right on top. Then you can place a clamp on both sides. And once you tighten both of your clamps, you'll see that that bow is completely eliminated. But I also mentioned the cambered Caul. Let me quickly tell you how that works. If you look at my cambered Caul, you'll notice that it's only taped on one side, and that's because this is only a one-sided Caul. You can see that in the center it's touching itself, while on the sides it's got a little bit of room. Now I like to use this Caul for wider glue-ups that use smaller pieces. A cambered Caul initially provides all the pressure right in the center of your glue-up, and as you add your clamps, that pressure is spread out to the very sides. And the cambered Caul is used in the same fashion as a straight Caul. It just provides a little bit more pressure than the straight one. Now that we've talked about Cauls for a bit, I want to talk about my next clamping tip, which has everything to do with edge banding. Now when I first started woodworking, I thought I had to have bandy clamps, and these are great. However, you don't need bandy clamps to get your edge banding done. Now bandy clamps make quick and easy work of adding edge banding to any plywood. The problem is I always run out of these clamps. A better alternative, in my opinion, is to simply use blue tape. Yes, blue tape is an invaluable clamp in my shop, but it's not only good for edge banding, it's also got some other uses. By adding a couple of strips to miters, you'll be amazed at how much pressure these two strips of tape can provide. So don't overlook the power of using blue tape as a clamp. Now I'd like to talk about a tool that used to intimidate me when I first started out, and that's the router. I've got two quick tips about the router. My first tip relates to the order of operations on how to use a router, and I probably didn't learn this tip until about 3 years of woodworking. You see, when you're using a router, there's a high likelihood that you're not only going to be rounding long grain, but also end grain. And end grain is quite chippy. It tears out much easier than long grain. And because of this, I always use the router on the end grain first. And here you can see some of that tear out I got on the very end. But I can instantly clean up all this by doing the long grain next. And if we look at that same corner with the tear out, you can see how clean it is after following that order of operations. The next router tip that I have relates to using a pattern bit or a flush trim bit. Typically when I'm using one of these bits, I'm starting off with a bandsaw. I'll make a template and then I'll use that template to rough cut out all the pieces that I'll need. And when I used to rough cut these out, I would leave a lot of extra room, leaving the majority of the waste to be hogged out over at the router table. I mean, we're talking some serious waste that I used to leave on these rough cut pieces, as much as 1/2 inch and sometimes as much as 1 inch. That is until I experienced router kickback for the first time. And router kickback is probably one of the scariest forms of kickback that you can get in your shop. And that scary experience made me realize that I need to cut my rough cut pieces just a little bit closer to my template. I don't like to go above 1/8 inch and 1/4 inch at the very max. In fact, using a Sharpie is my favorite way to cut out these pieces now. I'll take my original template and I'll trace it with a Sharpie, and then I'll cut just outside that line. So do the majority of your work either with your jigsaw or your bandsaw, and just let your router table clean it up. The last category that I have for this video is a miscellaneous category. These are all items that I couldn't fit into the other categories. First up is wood glue. Now when I first started out, I would buy those huge 1-gallon jugs of wood glue and put them into a bunch of small containers. And this was a good idea in theory, but the problem was I wasn't going through a 1-gallon jug of wood glue fast enough. I also tended to reach for the same dispensers, so this left me with a bunch of containers with all sorts of solidified wood glue. And I even had some left over in that 1-gallon jug, which did the same thing. You see, what I didn't know is that wood glue isn't good forever. In fact, if you look at your wood glues, you'll find a born-on date, and you can expect that glue to last for about 1 to 2 years after that date. So I'm a big proponent of buying smaller batches of wood glue that I know I'll go through either in a month or 2. Because if you've ever worked with wood glue that's getting old, you'll know that it's thick, it's clumpy, and just a pain to work with. My next miscellaneous tip has to do with the changing infrastructure of most woodworking shops. I don't think you need an air compressor.
Why are you on the floor?
You see, most tools are going from a pneumatic-driven system to a battery-operated system. I thought for sure I'd have a pneumatic-driven brad nailer by now, but the battery-operated tools are getting so good and so cheap there really isn't a need for one. Since I bought my air compressor, I've only had an air hose on it, and I use this to blow away sawdust before finishing and just to clean up the place. But you can get those same results with a leaf blower, which you probably already have laying around in your garage. The next thing that I want to talk about in my miscellaneous category is CA glue. Now there's a lot of different varieties of CA glue, including thin, medium, as well as thick. Now each one of those CA glues has different applications, but as a woodworker there's one of those three that I use more than any of the other.
Thick or thin?
And that CA glue is the thick CA glue. And it really has everything to do with the consistency of it. The thick CA glue has a viscosity that's perfect for woodworking. I find that the medium and especially the thin tend to run just a little bit too much for me, while the thick seems to stay in place right where you need it. I use it all the time for things like stabilizing knots in my workpieces, or in combination with wood glue to get that quick clamping pressure. So if you're new to woodworking and you haven't checked out the amazing capabilities of CA glue, it's going to blow your mind, and I suggest you start off with thick. Next up, I'd like to talk about router bit and drill bit speeds. So not all drill bits and router bits are created equal. Some are big and some are small. Let's take a look at a couple of examples to show you what I'm talking about. On the right, you'll find two sets of router bits, and on the left, you'll find two sets of drill bits, and you can obviously tell all of these bits have different circumferences. And it's these circumferences that make a big difference in the speed at which each one of these bits will be spinning. If we look at the larger circumference bits, these will be spinning much faster than the smaller bits, even though they're at the same RPMs. And it's because of this that we need to adjust the RPMs of both our drill press and our router depending on what bit we're using. And it really is quite simple. The larger the bit, the less RPMs you'll need, while the smaller bit requires a few more RPMs. And I'll leave some links to my website for some guidelines on what these RPMs should be for both your drill press and your router table. Well, hard to believe it, but we're down to our last tip. And if you've been counting, we're actually at 30 tips. And our last tip has to do with snipe. And no, it's not that mystical creature that you go looking for in the forest. Snipe is that frustrating divot that you oftentimes get on the front and the back of your wood when you're using your planer or your jointer. Now there is a couple of ways you can deal with this. One of the best ways is to make sure your planer and your jointer are properly calibrated, making sure that your infeed and outfeed table are properly aligned. But this video is for those just starting out, and many of those people only have a planer, so let me show you how to reduce that snipe with the planer. To reduce snipe, you can do it in one of two ways. One of the best ways is to stagger your wood as you're placing it through your planer. You can also place your wood in sequentially with no gaps in between each board. By doing one of these two methods, coupled with giving yourself a little extra wood on each plank, you can be assured that snipe won't affect your projects. Well, that does it. 30 full-blown tips and observations I've made over my last few years in woodworking. And I hope that you found at least one piece of information that you can take from this video and apply it to your workshop. Well, thanks so much for joining me today on checking out these 30 fast-paced tips. If you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and leave a comment. Also, please check out my new website, www.flynndoggwoodwork.com. Until next time, take care as always. Once again, thanks to Auskang for sponsoring this video. Check out the links below to see how you can purchase their amazing smart card wallet.